Hello, oceanography students. In this lecture, we're going to start to learn about ocean circulation. This is one of two lectures that we'll learn about circulation of water within our oceans. And this lecture is specifically on ocean circulation that is driven by density. That is, water masses that are more dense sink, water masses that are less dense rise, and that those differences basically create movement of water within our oceans. Density-driven ocean circulation is called thermohaline circulation. This is because thermo represents temperature and salinity is represented by haline. So temperature and salinity are the two main factors that control water density in our oceans. Okay, so thermohaline circulation identifies the fact that this circulation is driven by density, and the two main factors that affect density in the ocean are temperature and salinity. Temperature tends to be the main component in most areas, but salinity is especially important in areas where the temperature is constant. For example, poles, or even in places where you have warm water. In some places you might have more saline water, which makes it more dense. Deep water is always formed at high latitudes at the surface. And then because it's so dense, it sinks down. So the conservation of mass states that if a mass of water sinks, another mass of water must rise up somewhere else. So that basically creates an ocean conveyor belt where you have very dense water forming at high latitudes, such as Antarctica or around Greenland, and you have dense water that's forming at those areas, and then because it's so dense, it sinks down through the oceans and it pushes other water out of the way. And so in that way you create this ocean conveyor belt that is driven by the creation of very dense water in the high latitudes. Okay, and so that's what the ocean conveyor belt looks like. The purple dots here represents areas where the very dense water is forming and sinking down, and so you see from those little purple circles, dots, you have these blue currents. That basically means that this water is sinking down and flowing throughout the world's oceans. You see this blue water sinking down and flowing through the world's oceans. And now the arrows aren't necessarily 100% accurate because the Antarctic water will also come up through the Atlantic as well. It's not just the water up towards the Arctic and Greenland that is coming down, right? This is also going up, so it's not totally accurate, but what it's trying to show you is that you have dense water that's sinking, and then you have basically shallow currents that are moving through because they are low density. Okay, and so essentially they eventually get to the higher latitudes where the water gets cooled and the density increases. Okay, so density drives large-scale ocean circulation. So again, what affects density? We should have said temperature and salinity. But why do these two factors affect density so much? Well, for temperature, as water gets colder, the molecules contract until it gets to 4 degrees Celsius, and then they spread out or expand, and therefore, as they get colder than 4 degrees Celsius, they are getting less dense. As far as, and so when we think of the ocean, you can just kind of ignore that 4 degrees Celsius rule because really the water's just, it's liquid. Okay, so we're just thinking of liquid water as far as thermohaline circulation. Okay, so the water gets colder and it gets denser. So that's really what you should think about. And then as far as salinity goes, if you add salt to the water, it makes it denser. So because salt is denser than water is, it has more mass per volume, and therefore adding salt to it makes the water denser. So the higher the salinity, the denser the water. And temperature and salinity vary around the globe, and therefore they affect the density of water around the globe. Okay, so what affects the temperature and salinity of the water? The atmospheric conditions, like we learned about last week. Okay, so places where the sun is heating the earth are going to be warmer, right? Places that are not heated are going to be colder. Areas where you're getting a lot of rain are going to have lower salinity. Areas that have a lot of evaporation are going to have higher salinity, etc. Okay, so let's go over that again. So how do atmospheric conditions affect seawater? How do the atmospheric conditions affect the temperature of the seawater? Well, it depends on the latitude. Remember that the sun is basically hitting the equator most directly and least directly towards the poles. And therefore the equator, the water at the equator is going to be warmer at the surface than the water near the poles will. As far as salinity goes, how will the atmospheric conditions affect salinity? Well, one factor is rain. Rain is going to dilute the water and make it less saline. So that lowers the saltiness of the water, and therefore that would decrease the density of the water. Evaporation. Well, when you evaporate water, the salt is left behind. Therefore, the area where evaporation occurred is going to be more salty because it's concentrated more, right? If rain dilutes it, evaporation concentrates it, okay? And so places that have a lot of evaporation are going to be very salty, and therefore the density is going to increase. What about ice forming? If ice forms, then this is basically going to be very similar to the process of evaporation. When ice forms, the salt is left behind. So again, it gets more concentrated and the salinity is higher. Melting of ice is the opposite. It's just like rain, right? So you're adding fresh water back into the water, and therefore you have a decrease in the salinity and therefore a decrease in the density. Okay, so on this graph over to the right here, we have two things that are graphed, and that is temperature in red and salinity in green. Our y-axis is latitude, and it's put right next to a map of the world, so you can see what that latitude is. Okay, so here's 60 degrees south, here's 40 degrees south, here is 20 degrees south, here is 0 degrees, here is 20 degrees north, here is 40 degrees north, here is 60 degrees north, here is 80 degrees north. Okay, so as far as how the temperature is going to change, I feel like this is fairly obvious, right? As you go closer to the equator, the temperature is going to increase, and as you go farther away from the equator, the temperature is going to decrease, okay? This is, let me go back for a second, this is the temperature at the surface of the water, and the green is the salinity at the surface of the water, okay? So surface water is going to be warmest around the equator, between the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer, which, you know, if we're going to relate it to our atmospheric circulation model, we can just generally say it's going to be warmer between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. Okay, as you get farther away, it's going to get colder and colder. But then you look over here at the salinity, and you see that it's making all kinds of changes, right? It's lower here at 60 degrees, then it peaks over here, close to 30 degrees, and then it decreases at the equator, and then it peaks again close to 30 degrees south, and then it decreases again. Okay, so let's look at why that happens. Okay, so remember that you have cold polar air at 60 degrees north that meets up with warmer air. It's going to be moister, and that creates rain. Okay, so it rains at 60 degrees north, and then at the equator you have moist heated air that rises up. And as you get up into the upper atmosphere, that moisture can't be held as a gas anymore, and so it condenses and it rains there. Okay, so both of these locations are have a high amount of rain, and therefore that's going to dilute the salinity of the water. Okay, so you see at 60 degrees north at the equator, 60 degrees south, you have lowered salinity. Right now at the equator, you also have a bit of evaporation, and that's why the salinity is higher at the equator than it is at 60 degrees south or 60 degrees north. Then you have these peaks, over here. So at 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, where those peaks occur, remember that you have dry air that is sinking, and therefore that's going to be an area that is dry. It's not rainy. And also, it's about where the sun hits pretty directly. And so rather than having rain, you have the opposite thing, which is a high amount of evaporation. And that evaporated water doesn't rise back up at that location. Instead, it evaporates and then it gets taken back towards the equator or taken back towards 60 degrees north or south. So 30 degrees north or 30 degrees south are going to be high in salinity because of the high amount of evaporation. Okay, and so that's why we see these peaks in salinity here and here. Okay, well, like I said, we'll just say that that's 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. Okay, and we can see from this this image showing the surface salinity in the ocean, with the higher salinity being in red or orange and lower salinity being purple. You can see you have high salinity around 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. And what that means is that we have more dense water here than we have at the equator. Okay, so we have cold water that forms in Antarctica and also in Greenland. Now, the time that it forms is usually in the winter time when it's the coldest, and also ice is forming and therefore making the water saltier. So both of those factors make the water more dense. Okay, that water that then gets very dense sinks to the bottom and flows through the world's ocean basins. Okay, whereas warmer water near the equator is going to float on the surface of the water. Okay, so we have dense water that forms at Antarctica and near Greenland in the Arctic. It gets very dense, and so it sinks down and it stays on the bottom of the ocean, whereas you have warm water around the equator, and therefore it's low density, and so it sinks on the it floats on the surface. But since that was just talking about the surface of the water, what about below the surface of the water? Okay, so let's start with salinity. How does salinity change below the surface of the water? Water that is deeper than the surface water is no longer in contact with the atmosphere. So the deep water salinity is basically going to be similar regardless of where you are in the ocean, because the deep water is always formed near the poles. Okay, so the deeper you go, the less the water is affected by atmospheric conditions such as precipitation and evaporation. So the temperature and salinity when the water mass was created does not change once it sinks or moves away from that atmosphere. Okay, so basically the water that forms at the poles gets cold and dense, and it sinks down, and it stays with those same characteristics of temperature and salinity, because now it's no longer near the surface, it's no longer affected by atmospheric conditions, so essentially its temperature and salinity are going to be locked in. Okay, so as you go from the surface down, we see this kind of thing happening. All right, so there are two different areas that are graphed on this. So the y-axis is the depth, so this is the surface, and then you have 4,000 meters here, and then the x-axis is the salinity, and it's increasing towards the right as you go from here. This is 33 parts per thousand, and over here is 37 parts per thousand. Okay, and then you have two lines that are here. The line on the left is where you would have low salinity at the surface, and the one on the right is where you have high salinity at the surface. And you can already see that once you get down below the surface, the salinity gets pretty similar. It's surrounding 35, which is, again, the average salinity of the ocean. So the surface water varies by latitude and by ocean. The line on the right there represents water that has a high amount of evaporation, which would lead to a high salinity level. The line on the left would represent an area that gets lots of rain, which means a high amount of fresh water being added to that surface water, and therefore means a lower salinity level. Then you get to this region, as you go deeper, it's called the halocline. You see that when you get to that region, you see this drastic change in the salinity in this line, and you also see this drastic change in the salinity in this line, right? This line is showing a drastic increase. This line is showing a drastic decrease, okay? So the halocline is an area of rapidly changing salinity with depth, and then below the halocline, it tends to even out because the deeper water is not affected by surface conditions. Now, what about temperature? How does that change with depth? Well, it depends on where you are, because if you are near the equator, the temperature at the surface is pretty high, right? You have warm water at the surface, but then as you go down in depth, you have very cold water. So the difference between surface water and deep water is very extreme. Whereas near the poles, the surface temperatures are very cold, and the bottom temperature is also very cold. So you don't really see much of a difference between the surface water and the deep water as far as temperature goes near the poles, or places where you have deep water forming. And that's what's shown in this graph here. The left graph is showing you close to the equator, and the right graph is showing you close to the poles. So depth is on your y-axis, so here's 0, here's 4,000 meters, same thing over here, 0, 4,000 meters, and then x-axis is temperature increasing towards the right, so here's 0 all the way up to 24, 0 all the way up to 24 here as well. And you see that this line right here is showing you at the surface you have very warm water. As you go down in depth, it drastically decreases, and then it kind of levels out. Whereas over here at high latitudes, you have cold water at the surface, and you have cold water down at the bottom. And so you just have a straight line. There's no difference in the temperature from the surface down. Whereas at low latitudes, there's a very big difference in the temperature as you go from the surface down. So we end up with low density water sitting on top of higher density water. And then what factors influence density? This is just review. Temperature, salinity, and pressure. So these graphs are showing you how density changes with temperature, how density changes with salinity, and how density changes with pressure. So the first one, as the temperature decreases, the density increases. So temperature is increasing to the right. So if we have low temperature, you have high density. As you have warmer and warmer temperature, the density decreases. So that's why we have a negative slope on this line, right? It's going down, it's decreasing as the temperature increases. For salinity, the density increases with increasing salinity, right? So low salinity, low density. As you increase the salinity, you increase the density. So you also have a positive slope here. For pressure, it's basically similar to salinity, except there's not as big of an effect of pressure. So with low pressure, you have low density. With increasing pressure, you have a slight increase in density. So again, the main factors are temperature and salinity. Okay, so how does density change with depth? Well, the temperature tends to be the major factor. So density really depends on latitude. With the lower latitudes, having low density water at the surface and high density water down deep. With high latitudes, you have high density water at the surface and high density water down deep. So near the equator, the surface temperature is high, so density at the surface is low, which means the change with depth is extreme. Near the poles, the surface temperatures are low, so density at the surface is high. That means that essentially you can have a lot of mixing between the surface and deep water. And mixing is important in the marine environment because it mixes up nutrients. And so it basically brings nutrients up to the surface where little phytoplankton algae can essentially use it to photosynthesize and to grow and reproduce. And that's important because they're at the base of the food web. So if there's a lot of them, then there's a lot of other organisms as well. So these graphs here, again, the one on the left is low latitude and the one on the right is high latitudes. So at low latitudes, you have very low density at the surface, drastically increasing, and then it levels out. At high latitudes, you have very high density of the surface and high density down below. And that basically means that you have mixing. Okay, so based on temperature, what we have in the low latitudes, because there's a drastic change as you go from the surface down, what that change is called, that region where the change exists, is called the thermocline. This is a layer of rapidly changing temperature with depth. At the poles, you see that it's just a straight line. There is no thermocline at the poles because the water at the surface is very cold, the water down deep is also very cold. So what we would call that is isothermal. Iso meaning the same temperature. So same temperature at the top, same temperature at the bottom. Now because temperature is the main thing that affects density, we can also see this relationship. Okay, so this is these two are density graphs, where you have low latitudes on this graph and high latitudes on this graph. So again, equator, poles. Okay, so towards the surface at the equator, because the water is warm, the density is low. Then as you have this drastic reduction in temperature, you have this drastic increase in density. That increase, that area where this is drastically changing density, is called the pycnocline. And I didn't say yet, but cline basically means change. Okay, so thermocline, that's change in temperature. Pycnocline, that's a change in density. And then the other one we learned previously was halocline, which is a change in salinity, saltiness. Okay, and then notice that just as there's no thermocline present here, there's no pycnocline present here. With the low temperature water, you have high density water at the poles. Okay, and so what this creates are different water masses as you go from the surface down in depth. If you are at the surface of the water, what we would call that water is the mixed layer. And that's because wind mixes it up and kind of that whole layer is kind of mixed together. But then as you go down below the mixed layer, you have what's called the upper water. And the upper water exists wherever the pycnocline is. And then down below that, you have what's called deep water. Deep water is the water that generally has formed near the poles and has sunk and moved throughout the ocean basins. So you could be taking, if you used an instrument to take water samples at the equator, what you would find is that at the surface you are getting water sample that was from the equator. It was created there. But as you go down in depth, you're going to get water that came from other places. Like you may get water that came all the way from the Mediterranean, and you're even as you go down deeper, deeper, and deeper, you're going to get water that came from near Greenland. Then you're going to get water that came from the Arctic, all the way at the equator, Antarctica, all the way at the equator. All right, so these are different water masses that are essentially named for the areas that they formed in. Okay, so we can see that if we look at this just general depiction of the Atlantic Ocean. So here's Greenland over here in the north, right? Antarctica is in the south, and here's the equator. So as you go down from the equator, you end up at the mixed layer at the surface. Then you get the pycnocline, which is basically called the upper water. And then you go down deeper and you get the deeper layer, which came from Greenland and from Antarctica. Okay, and you can kind of see that over here in Greenland, you have that dark blue color because that's the water that is all down here as well, and the Antarctic water is also the same. Okay, now we can look at the Atlantic Ocean and see that there are actually specific names for these water masses. Okay, so we have Antarctica over here and Greenland over here. So the densest water forms around the Antarctic Ocean or the Southern Ocean in the wintertime. So that water gets very dense and it sinks down and it flows throughout the Atlantic Ocean on the bottom. Okay, so then we come over here to Greenland in the north, and here's a little map down here to show you where we are, right? We're in Greenland now, Antarctica would be down here, so this is basically just a transect through the Atlantic Ocean, taking it and looking through it with Greenland on this side right here, and then Antarctica over here. Okay, so now back to what we were talking about with the water masses. Here we have Greenland. That water is very cold, so it sinks down. But you know what? it's not as dense as the Antarctic water is, and therefore as it sinks down, it's not going to push the Antarctic water out of the way. Instead, it's going to settle above it because it's lower in density than that water is. Okay, so this is dense water that forms in the Norwegian Sea, in the Erminger Sea, actually I'm not sure, Erminger, and then the Labrador Sea and the Mediterranean Sea would actually be a little bit less dense than this because it's not as cold, it's warmer, but it's really salty, and so that's why it's listed here. So generally, the dense water that's coming from up here, we can just say it's around Greenland. You don't need to remember the names of the seas. Okay, and then in the surface, at the equator, you have really warm water because the sun is beating down on it, and also you have a lot of rain at the equator, so it's low in salinity. So it's also going to be low in density. And I want to draw your attention to this little area right here. You see that there's water moving up near the Antarctic. When water moves up, we call that upwelling, and when water moves down, we call that downwelling. Okay, so because there's no pycnocline in cold ocean columns, the water can mix very easily. And when we say mix, we're talking about deep water and surface water. Those waters can move. At the equator, the water's not going to move. The water that's down deep is going to stay down deep, and the water that's off the surface is going to stay in the surface. You're not going to see a whole lot of mixing here. Okay, and so this area, basically where the North Atlantic water comes back up because it's lower in density than the Antarctic water, the water comes up, and then some of it cools and goes back down close to Antarctica and becomes Antarctic bottom water, and then some of it that's farther away from Antarctica gets cold and dense and it sinks again. But it's not as dense as the North Atlantic water that's coming up here, and so that's why it's sinking over here and it's settling above the North Atlantic water. So that's what's shown right here, the Antarctic intermediate water, because it's cold, but it's not as cold or as dense as the Antarctic bottom water or as the North Atlantic deep water, and therefore it settles up on top. Excuse me. So what scientists can do is they can record, well, they can collect water samples and they can test it for the temperature and salinity at different depths. And then they can make what's called a TS diagram. It's a temperature and salinity graph, essentially. So this is a temperature and salinity graph from a conductivity temperature depth recorder, which is an instrument that essentially you put it in the water, and then you can lower it down, and as you're lowering it, it is recording the temperature, and it's recording the depth, and it's recording the salinity of the water. So conductivity is how we measure salinity, because water, pure water, is not conductive at all. It's the actual stuff that's dissolved in the water that makes it conductive. So the higher the conductivity, the more the stuff that's dissolved in it, and so that's how we measure salinity in the ocean in a lot of places. So imagine that you go to, say around the equator, and you put a CCD in the water, and it starts at the surface recording, and it goes down, and it keeps recording, When those scientists take that up, they can plug it into a computer, and they can download all that data and make it into this nice little graph. And scientists who study this can actually look at a TS diagram and look at the pattern of how you have warm water, and then it increases, and then it decreases, and such. They could know basically where in the world's oceans that water sample came from. Okay, so here we have warm water at the surface, drastically declining in temperature, and then it actually increases slightly in temperature, in salinity, and then it decreases again in temperature and in salinity. And so these little red blocks are showing you what the average is for Antarctic intermediate water, what the average is for North Atlantic deep water, and what the average is for Antarctic bottom water. And you won't have to make any graphs like this. I'm just showing you them. Okay, if you have any questions, please post them on the weekly discussion, and make sure to complete the assignments and take the quizzes for the week. Okay. Now I'm just going to run through a quick little quiz for you just to practice. Okay, So what drives thermohaline circulation? Is it density, wind, Coriolis effect, or none of the above? You should have said density. What are the main factors that affect density? Temperature and salinity. Remember that it's thermohaline circulation. Thermo stands for temperature and haline stands for salinity. Okay, so it's density driven due to temperature and salinity. What is the relationship between density and temperature? As the temperature increases, the density increases. As the temperature decreases, the density increases. As the temperature decreases, the density decreases. Or there's no relationship between temperature and density. You should have said B. The temperature decreases, the density increases. And if you said the temperature increases and the density decreases, that would be correct as well. What is the relationship between density and salinity? As the salinity increases, the density increases. As the salinity decreases, the density increases. As the salinity decreases, the density decreases, or both A and C are correct. That is correct. Both A and C basically are the same thing, right? As the salinity increases, the density increases, and as the salinity decreases, the density decreases. That's basically showing a direct relationship between density and salinity. What is the thermocline? It is the area of rapidly changing temperature with depth. What is the halocline? It is the area of rapidly changing salinity with depth. And finally, the pycnocline. It is an area of rapidly changing density with depth. In which of the following would you expect to find the lowest salinity water? At the North Pole where ice is forming, at the equator where it is raining, or at 30 degrees north latitude where dry air is blowing over the sea surface? You should say B, at the equator where it is raining, because you're adding fresh water back to the salt water and that dilutes it, and therefore that's going to decrease salinity. For A, the North Pole where ice is forming, that's taking fresh water out and leaving salt behind, so that makes it more concentrated, and that would increase salinity. At 30 degrees north latitude, where dry air is blowing over the sea surface, when dry air is blowing over the sea surface, that increases evaporation. And so if you have a lot of evaporation, that's taking fresh water out and again concentrating the salt. That's why that's not correct either. In which of the following would you expect to find the highest salinity water? A, at the North Pole where ice is forming, B, where a river is emptying into the ocean, or C, at the North Pole where ice is melting? You should have said A, where ice is forming, because again, where ice is forming, you're taking fresh water out and leaving the salt behind and making it more concentrated. For B, where a river is emptying into the ocean, that's fresh water that's being added back into the ocean, and therefore that's going to make it less salty. And for C, at the North Pole where ice is melting, when ice is melting, that's fresh water being added back in, because ice is basically made of fresh water and leaves the salt behind when it's forming. Where is the deepest water forming? A, at the equator in 30 degrees latitude, B, near Washington State, C, near Greenland and Antarctica. You should have said Greenland and Antarctica. Deepest water forms in the coldest areas of our oceans. Okay, again, post your questions for me under the weekly discussion. Thanks.